Hello, friends. I'm really glad that you have joined us as we continue our walk through the Gospel of Luke and we think about the shape of salvation in this Gospel and the shape of salvation in our own lives. I know the last couple of weeks have been really trying for all of us. And again, like I said the first week, I hope this time together, reading the Gospels is a way to bring us into God's Word and deliberate together how we think about our moment, how we live into this moment. What I'm hoping is that we can find a little bit of salvation even in the midst of so much tribulation, so much uncertainty, so much worry. And I wonder if one of the things that we might learn as we read these texts and live through this particular season of life is what it looks like to move from fear to hope into the kind of wholeness of body, mind, and community that the gospel is calling us to. Maybe in these moments we have time to reflect on the things that matter most and what we want to hold on to when life goes back to something that looks something more like normal in the future. So let's turn to the Gospel of Luke. We have started each time looking at Luke's preface with an insight every time of something that Luke reveals to us as we read these first four verses. So reading that again together. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So we talked about a couple of different insights so far. Number one, we talked about how Luke is not the first person to write the story, that he's relying on the witness of others to tell the story. Number two, that Luke is trying to write an orderly account, and that what he means by orderly may be more theological and literary than it is historical or chronological. And last week we talked about how this is not just a story of the past, but a story about the present and the future, and especially in that little phrase, the events that have been fulfilled among us, that this is a story still unfolding in our own lives, still unfolding in our own midst today. The fourth insight I want to bring to us is to notice how Luke tells us that he relies on eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So he says, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. That is, that what he receives is not just written text, but living testimony from those who were there, and he wasn't there, so he can't be an eyewitness. And those other servants of the word who have maintained, preserved, and shared these stories. That before Luke writes this down, there are other people in this community who, in living memory, were remembering these stories of Jesus, sharing these stories of Jesus, and interpreting these stories of Jesus. That Luke doesn't imagine that he's the first person to think these thoughts, to tell these stories. He is collecting them for his community, but in doing so, he's leaning on the testimony of those who have gone before him. Those people who were there, and those people who maybe were not there but have been entrusted with the stories that he's been sharing. Again, so to think about the Gospel of Luke, not just as a kind of one time story that Luke tells, but as a long term tradition that Luke is a part of interpreting and sharing, and that now we're a part of now interpreting and sharing as well. Our text this week comes from Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 26. It's a fun little story about healing. It's a story about Jesus disrupting life. We saw that last week when he disrupts the order of the community where the woman who was called a sinner is a part of. And Jesus is going to once again disrupt this community. The reactions are going to be quite different, but I think a reaction that can be really instructive for us as we ponder what salvation looks like in this story. So Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 26. Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. As he stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house, but in the tombs. So a couple things we might notice as we begin. One is to notice, as Justo Gonzalez does in his commentary on Luke, that this is the first and only time that Jesus finds himself outside of Jewish communities, outside of Jewish territory. This is the one and only time that Jesus is hanging out among the Gentiles in an area that would be more known for being a Gentile area. So he goes across the Galilee to be in this place. The first person he meets there is a person with demons. So we've met a few people with demons so far in the story. We saw the man with the unclean demon in Luke chapter 4, but now this person's going to stick out, and this demonic possession is going to be distinct. Notice how the man of the city with demons is characterized here. For a long time, he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house, but lived in the tombs. That is, that he's not really a part of the culture or the society. He is out there as this wild person, this person on the margins of this community. Not only that, he doesn't live in a house, but he lives in the tombs. He lives among the dead. He lives in this space between the living and the dead. So he's really not a part of this community. He's just wandering in the tombs without any clothing. We keep reading. When he saw Jesus, so this is when the man who has the demons, when he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. So Jesus commands the unclean spirit to come out. And here the man is speaking, but it's really the unclean spirit, the demon, now speaking out, saying, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" I wonder if the demon is wondering, what are you doing out here among the Gentiles in the first place? "I beg you, do not torment me." All right, that in expelling him, Jesus, earlier remember, has the authority to make these demons fly away. That authority is still there, but here we I wonder if Luke is kind of bringing us into this literary moment as well to have this conversation between Jesus and the demon. "Do not torment me," the demon says. In parentheses in the translation, it points out, for many times it had seized him. The demon had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. So notice here that here we see something about the power of that demonic force, the way that it controls the man, but also the way that his neighbors react to him too. Because of his demonic possession, his neighbors, maybe to protect him, to protect the man invaded with demons so he can't hurt himself, is kept bound together with chains and shackles, but it probably is more to protect the community, that they saw a threat, they saw a danger in the very presence of this man invaded by a demon. But the force is so powerful that even these bonds could be broken and the demons would drive this man into the wilds. Here, I wonder if there's a reference back to Jesus being driven not by demons into the wilderness, but by the Spirit into the wilderness in Luke chapter 4. Here, I think it's a way of saying not only does he live in the tombs, but that he's also driven into the wilderness, into a place of chaos, into a place of uncertainty. Here we have a person not just invaded by demons, but also, not just on the margins of his community, but not even a part of his community. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. It's not just one demon, it's a whole army of them. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. The term that the demons use here to describe themselves as legion is the same kind of terminology that you would have used for a Roman army. I think reflecting the power that they hold over this man is the kind of power that an army can wield, the kind of death-dealing power that they can deal. That's not just an army, but now an army inside this person's body, invading them, ruling over them. The legion of demons basically begged him not to go back into the abyss. And when ancient texts like this talk about the abyss, what they're talking about is kind of this watery, chaotic place this watery, chaotic place of disorder, of death, of loss. Don't send us back there, they ask. The story continues. Now there on the hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. Another sign here that we're not in a Jewish area is the presence of pigs in the area. The demons beg Jesus, let them enter into those, and Jesus allows it. He's got the authority not just to expel demons, but to tell them where to go. He sends them into this swine herd, and something very striking happens. When they enter these pigs, the pigs rush down and head into the lake and are drowned. So you remember I mentioned just earlier that the abyss in the ancient imagination is this watery, chaotic place. And especially in the first century Jewish imagination, the ocean, the seas are places of chaos and death. So in the book of Revelation, when the New Jerusalem is being described, the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven. In that New Jerusalem, there is no death, there is no tears, there is no mourning, there is no grief, there is no sickness. There's also no ocean, there's no sea in the New Jerusalem. And as a Puerto Rican, that hurts my heart very much. But it makes sense in the ancient Jewish imagination because seas are chaotic places of shipwrecks and death. First century Israelites are not often seafaring people. So the ocean, the seas, the waters are these watery places of chaos. So notice the irony. The demons say, don't send us back to the abyss, to a watery, chaotic place. But the very moment that they're cast into another living being, the demons can do nothing else but to drive themselves into a place of chaos and death. That's their identity. That's what they do. That's what demonic forces do, is that they invade bodies and drive those bodies toward death. So the pigs here are drowned, and the story continues. When the swineherd saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. You won't believe what just happened. Then people came out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. It's an extraordinary transformation from where the story started. When the story starts, this man is invaded by demons. He's not wearing any clothes. He's hanging out in the wilderness among the tombs. People try to shackle him. He breaks the shackles and runs away. And here we find him after this extraordinary encounter with Jesus, sitting with Jesus, and he's clothed and he's of right mind. And I would think, that the reaction of the people, as so often these healings have caused for people along the way, the reaction has been for people to be in awe, to be in wonder, to wonder what God is doing. But something very different happens in this narrative. Instead, Luke records, and they were afraid. They were afraid. The reaction to this healing, to this transformation, to this exorcism is not celebration, it's not awe, it's not reverence, but fear. And maybe these days we can understand a bit more why they were afraid. I wonder if the people of this community worried that if this man no longer had within his body these forces of chaos and death, that those forces of chaos and death might be out there in the world somewhere. What if they come to my community? What if they come to my family? What if they come to me? As long as they were locked up in that one person's body, that person at not even in the boundaries of our community, but outside of our community, then maybe we didn't have as much to worry about. What if those forces are now out there running wild and I'm their next victim? What if that's what they were afraid of? That those forces of death would not stop. Those forces of chaos would not cease. They would just find a new home. Or maybe they worry that this was only temporary, that as soon as Jesus went away, the demons would come back to the same guy. He would take off his clothes, he would go wander in the wilderness, and we'd have to shackle him up again. What if they weren't sure that this exorcism was for good? Maybe one more thing, maybe they worried that if chaos and death were not in that one person's body, then maybe they would no longer be controlled or isolated into one person. What if this meant a transformation of their community in a way they feared? Luke continues, those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. Seeing that he had been healed, seeing that he had been saved from these demons, they asked Jesus to please go away. The disruption you brought to our midst is not something that we're interested in. Now that you've freed these demons and God knows where they are, we don't want you around here anymore because we don't know what you're going to do next. If you healed him, then what are you going to do next? For, as Luke concludes, they were seized with great fear. They were afraid of Jesus' power. They were afraid of the salvation Jesus brought. They were afraid of the kind of place they would have to be if now this man invaded with demonic forces was healed. They weren't quite sure they wanted to be that community where he was healed. They were seized with great fear. I wonder if that's so often how we react in the presence of God's salvation. Not the kind of fear that is reverence and awe of God, but the kind of fear that wonders if everything changes and if everything is transformed, am I going to like the world on the other side of that salvation? The story concludes in this way. So he got into the boat and returned. This is Jesus. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with them. But Jesus sent him away, saying, return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. This man who has this encounter with Jesus says, let me go with you. Let me be a disciple. Let me be your follower. Let me go with you. Remember, Jesus earlier tells people to drop their nets and to go with him. And here, this man is ready and willing to go with Jesus, but Jesus says, no, go back home. Which at first glance to me seems kind of cruel. A community that previously had chained him up, had locked him up, had wanted him to just hang out in the tombs and be in the wilderness, a community that when he was well were still afraid of him, still afraid of the demons that might come back, still afraid of who he might be instead of who Jesus had made him to be. Those people had already rejected him once and seemed to be rejecting him again. But Jesus says, no, go back home and tell everyone how much God has done for you. And he does precisely that. And I wonder if at the end of this story, we're left in a similar place we were left in last week. Last week, we were left wondering, what are we going to do when God comes in and says, this person you call a sinner is no longer a sinner? Now, when Jesus has exorcised the demons in our communities, when Jesus has sent away the forces of death and chaos, when Jesus has made them flee, will we be afraid? Will we be asked Jesus to go away? Jesus, do not disrupt the world as we know it. Because maybe we're afraid of the world as God wants it. What if part of the shape of salvation is delivering us from that fear of what the world might be when God transforms it? What if part of salvation is sending people back to those places where they were previously rejected to help deliver those who rejected them before? What if part of the shape of salvation is not just the demonic man who is made well, but a whole community that is stitched back together when that man is now no longer on the margins of that community, but at its very center? The healing narratives in Luke, I think, ask us to wonder what the shape of wholeness looks like. What does it mean to be a whole person? When God saves us, when Jesus saves us and makes us whole once again, what do we have in mind? And I think here we have to be quite careful. Sometimes, too often, we impose our sense of wholeness upon other people's lives and upon other people's bodies. We assume we know that a body that is seemingly not disabled, a body that is heterosexual, a body often that's male and white, we assume that to be the standard of the world, the standard to which God might be saving us. But I wonder if God has a bigger imagination for wholeness than we tend to have. What if God's salvation is always surprising to us, always beyond our expectations, always exploding our expectations, that someone else's wholeness would look like mine? All right, y'all. We'll see you next week. Thanks for spending time together. Blessings in this time. Hold each other close. We'll talk next week.